I am here with Peter Murphy, who is the head of the communications at the Commonwealth Games Federation. The date is the 26th of February 2013 and we are in Peter's office in London. Can we start by just explaining the main roles and responsibilities of the Commonwealth Games Federation?
Certainly. The Commonwealth Games Federation is what's called the supreme governing body of the Games. What that means, that very grand phrase means, is we're responsible for awarding the Commonwealth Games and also ensuring and guaranteeing that the Commonwealth Games is staged successfully. We don't actually organise the Commonwealth Games themselves. What we do is each time a Commonwealth Games is awarded to a host city, that something's set up called an organising committee, and the organising committee is, as the name suggests, solely responsible for the actual operations and delivery of a particular Commonwealth Games.
So do you have a say in who hosts the Commonwealth Games?
Yeah, we do. The actual federation itself is a federation, so it's not like the International Olympic Committee. If you think about it, the International Olympic Committee has got 115 members who effectively are, as they would describe themselves, a sort of self-perpetuating elite of very rich and influential and powerful men and women from around the world. But the Commonwealth Games Federation is a federation, and so we've got 72 members. And our 72 members are the 72 nations and territories of the Commonwealth. Some of them are very large: India, the United Kingdom, England, Scotland, Wales, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa. And that goes right down to some that are very, very, very tiny indeed. So Vanuatu, or Niue, which is a very small island in the South Pacific, or the Falkland Islands, or most of the Caribbean islands. So we've got a very, very broad range of members. They go from every economic background, all kinds of, from very powerful countries to very small countries, and we cover, the entire planet. The Commonwealth is a very broad membership group.
Do you think there's a pressure on the host country to run a smooth Commonwealth Games?
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, historically the Commonwealth Games has tended to be hosted by the same 3 or 4 countries. So the first Commonwealth Games was held in 1930 in Hamilton in Canada, and since then it's been held variously in mostly Australia, Canada, the UK or New Zealand. I mean, those have been the host cities. Where for the first time it went somewhere else, that was in 2010 when the Commonwealth Games was awarded to the Indian capital, Delhi. And it was actually in a competition against Abuja in Nigeria. The Commonwealth Games in Delhi were, it's fair to say, very, very challenging indeed. Delhi in India itself had never previously hosted a Commonwealth Games or any major multi-sports event on that scale. And it was a very challenging and complex and interesting process to successfully stage those games, and I think everyone learned a great deal in the process. I think for some countries like India, hosting the Commonwealth Games is one way that a country manages its development, on a pathway where it's aspiring to, at some point perhaps, host an Olympic Games. And that goes for all kinds of countries. I mean, if you look at England, if you look at Britain, it was Britain's successful hosting of the Manchester 2002 Commonwealth Games which set the stage for the success of London 2012 and established Britain's credentials as a capable host. And I think it remains to be seen whether Delhi's hosting of the 2010 Games makes the Indians feel that they could perhaps successfully bid for an Olympic Games at some point in the future.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Is it true that there was some spin-off Commonwealth Games?
Well, the one franchise that we manage is the Commonwealth Youth Games, which started in 2000 in Edinburgh and since then been held in India, Pune in India and Bendigo, Australia, and most recently in the Isle of Man in 2011. And the Commonwealth Youth Games they're a really interesting event. I mean, they're much smaller than the actual Commonwealth Games, clearly, by several orders of magnitude. They're effectively open to, depends on the sport, but generally open to 14 to 18-year-olds. They're a developmental event, designed to sort of give young athletes an experience of an international event, on a Commonwealth level. So And we're really committed to them and very, very fond of them. They're a really good fun event, even if they don't have an extremely high public profile. And I can say from having been to them that, you know, they're great. They're an absolute scream. Certainly in the Isle of Man, it was really just really interesting to watch. You know, some of the up and coming athletes from Kenya, you know, who you just know are going to be huge names in the future. You know, just watching, you know, some really good young athletes from all these different countries. So yeah, we've got the youth games. There are other sports events. For instance, there is something called the Island Games, which is clearly very, very popular amongst Commonwealth, some of the smaller Commonwealth countries. But that's run by a separate committee. It's run by a separate event. And of course, I mean, what your listeners, what everyone will know, is the Olympic Games, the Commonwealth Games. A few people might have heard perhaps of something called the Pan American Games, you know, which clearly is what the name suggests. It's North and South America. But actually, what people won't know is there's actually a whole load of other multi-sports events. There's something called the Mediterranean Games. There's the Francophonie, which is for French-speaking countries. It's their equivalent of the Commonwealths. There's also the Lusitania Games, which is for Portuguese-speaking countries. There is even a version of the Commonwealth Games for Spanish-speaking countries. And there's the Asian Games, the Pacifica. So there's actually a whole lot of what's called, in the industry, it's called, from the Olympic Games going down, they're called TGEMs, which is Très Grand Événement Management, which is very large sports events, very large multi-sports events. But the largest of them all is the Olympic Games and the Commonwealth Games.
Okay. So it's quite a significant increase from 400 athletes in 1930 to over 4,000 in Delhi. Why do you think the Games are so popular? Why are they so successful?
They're actually perceived basically just as successful as the Olympic Games in terms of the attraction of our product. I mean, if you want to call the Commonwealth Games a product, you know, it's a product which sells very well. It's very popular with potential hosts. The reason for that is that the Commonwealth Games is deliberately kept very small. So we only have 10 core sports and then 7 optional sports. You can select any number of the optional sports, minimum of 3, maximum of 7, with only 2 of those being team sports. So it's possible for a host city to construct a sports program which really kind of suits what it needs. If you think about it, the offer of the Commonwealth Games is quite simply this. We can turn to a middle-sized city, okay, a city like Manchester, Cardiff, a Glasgow, you know, a Melbourne, somewhere like that. And basically the argument is if you're a middle-sized city with between 1 and 4 million inhabitants, and you decide that you want to refurbish your leisure estate, your sports estate, that there's a regeneration opportunity in a particular quarter or area or something that you need to do, then you can consider hosting the Commonwealth Games, because we can come into your city and we will ensure that it's extremely successful. We'll give it an identity, it'll pay very well. You know, only 2 Commonwealth Games have ever actually lost money, and not on a significant level. And most of them end up paying for their own regeneration. And so that's what successive host cities have done. It's what Victoria did in 1994, Kuala Lumpur 1998, Manchester 2002, probably most people will know really well, used the opportunity there to regenerate the east of the city, used the opportunity to build the City of Manchester Stadium, which resulted later on, a few years later, of Manchester City being bought by Sheikh Masood. They built the Velodrome, which is enormously successful. It's become the home of British cycling. It's where Victoria Pendleton, Chris Hoyle, the major British cyclists are based. That's what Glasgow is doing now in 2014. Glasgow is aiming to regenerate the sort of area south of the River Clyde, around the area of Dalmarnock, and you know, what a lot of people know as sort of the area near is what's well been known as the Gorbals. And that's an area which they've tried to regenerate several times in the past. But with difficulty. It's very hard to regenerate urban areas, but that's going to be much, much easier when you've got something like the Commonwealth Games to give it a lasting identity, to instill a sense of pride, to build facilities that are going to be absolutely world class. And that's what you get out of a Commonwealth Games, because a Commonwealth Games is by definition a global major world sports event. You know, it's often surprising for people to realise, for instance, that our biggest broadcast audience is in the United States. Our second biggest sports audience is actually non-Commonwealth countries, it's Russia. We've just sold the broadcast rights to China, which again doesn't compete in the Commonwealth Games. So in fact the Commonwealth Games is very popular. Now there's a downside to that as well. Unlike the Olympic Games, there's only a small number of countries which could host a Commonwealth Games, because first of all they have to be in the Commonwealth, and of course there are only a certain country, certain size. So realistically it's your India, Kenya, Nigeria, Australia, New Zealand, perhaps at some point in the future Pakistan, but Canada and Britain. Those are the countries that could host it, whereas the Olympic Games obviously could go to a much wider number of countries anywhere in the world.
You mentioned the 10 core sports. In 1930 there was originally 6 sports. Do you know why they were chosen? Or?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure why those original 6 were chosen, though I suspect it's probably just because of depth and attractiveness within the countries that were participating. But one thing about the Commonwealth Games is that up until 1998, the Commonwealth Games only had sports that had single participants in. So we didn't have any team sports at all in the Commonwealth Games, not even rowing or anything like that. The closest I guess you could argue we came to it was there were obviously relay events in athletics, but it wasn't until Kuala Lumpur that we introduced team sports such as netball. And briefly in Kuala Lumpur cricket as well. So team sports began in 1998, and that was a major turning point for the Commonwealth Games. So back in 1930 they were single events. That was very much the kind of amateur sports that people thought belonged on the programme of an event like a Commonwealth Game. It's something that's quite a controversial topic in the world of sports. A lot of people feel very strongly, for instance, that the Olympic Games, which does really now have a position of hoovering up every available sport to include on the programme. So golf is going to be on the programme of the Olympic Games in 2016 in Rio. Rugby sevens has been in since the last game. There's some argument in the sports world about which sports belong in something like the Commonwealth Games or the Olympic Games. Our stance is that a sport belongs in the Commonwealth Games if it's identifiable as a kind of very popular sport within the Commonwealth. We also have certain rules about universality. It has to be practiced by a relatively large number of our members. It also has to have depth, so it's not enough that it's practiced in a lot of countries. It has to be practiced by a reasonable number of people within those countries, because it has to be competitive. We have had sports on the programme in the past which have had a relatively small number of competitors, and therefore it becomes unfair because you're not really having a good competition for medals. So, sports do come and go from our programmes, and no sport is always absolutely guaranteed of being on the programme. We've just seen wrestling being expelled from the programme of the Olympic Games, and wrestling had been in since 1896, so it's not going to be in after 2020, and that was quite a shock. So it's an art, it's not a science, and there's a lot of politics involved, but I think the Commonwealth Games has a pretty good programme.
Okay, so you mentioned the team sports didn't come until later, and it was the same for gender. Women were only allowed to compete in the swimming in 1930, was that?
Actually, women did participate in some sports in the very first games, but not in any great numbers, and it wasn't until later that women achieved parity, although it was very, very quick. It's a really interesting question. I mean, obviously, women's sport has grown and developed. I don't think those of us involved in sport, we're quite conscious of the fact that it's not a men versus women argument, because actually, if you look at it historically, actually men have been the biggest supporters and the biggest proponents of women being involved in sport, historically, and have worked really hard to kind of provide opportunities for women in sport. But I think, like everything else, it just develops over time. And certainly, one of the strengths of the Commonwealth Games is that, and one of the things we often say as a position is that the Commonwealth Games is where stars are born. So it's very much where you see athletes at the beginning of their careers. And so if you think about it, you saw Ian Thorpe, one of the world's greatest swimmers. He went into Sydney 2000 already known as the Torpedo, and he got that reputation and that nickname from his performance in Kuala Lumpur at the 1998 Commonwealth Games. And if you think about it, when you saw great swimmers like Dawn Fraser, Rebecca Adlington, These are men and women who really first became famous and first had their experience of international competition, usually at the Commonwealth Games, when at the beginning of their careers.
So they're known as the Friendly Games. Do you think the framework still stands of human rights and democracy and race equality? Do you still think that's the same as the original games?
I would like to think that that's something that the Commonwealth Games still maintains very strongly. One of our three mottos, or the abiding principles of the Commonwealth Games, is that we're the friendly games, that we're a family, because we're a family of nations, and we're about equality. And the Commonwealth Games has always been called the friendly games because of that. What's a Commonwealth country? What is the Commonwealth? For most people across the Commonwealth exists as a very strong family of nations. There is an abiding, underlying culture which connects all Commonwealth countries, and that could be just as simple as a legal structure. The fact that all Commonwealth countries have the same legal basis, which makes it easy to trade from one Commonwealth country to the next. That's why it's so much easier to trade between Nigeria and Singapore, or Nigeria and Britain, than it is to trade between, say, Nigeria and Italy, because our courts are the same. They recognise each other's jurisdiction, they enforce each other's contracts. We share each other's family links on an individual and a societal basis. So that's what supports the Commonwealth, and that's what gives it its identity as the friendly games. What you see is people instantly, and the athletes, the crowds, the public, everyone. You can see that the friendships that are created and formed and that last forever, based across every sort of religious, racial and everything that divides us. What we've got in common is much greater than what divides us. But I'm not immune to the fact that there are differences as well, and we've seen that some Commonwealth countries have very different views. So, for instance, you'll still have some Commonwealth countries who have real issues with, say, lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender rights. That's a really difficult subject in some of our more conservative member states, and it's equally something about which people in some of the more liberal states like Britain or Canada feel very strongly about. But that's an issue that I think is kind of put to one side for the games themselves.
So do you think it was quite important to change from the original name, the British Empire Games, to the Commonwealth?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that's really frustrating is the fact that we've had 4 names, believe it or not. We started off as the British Empire Games, then we became the British Empire and Commonwealth Games, then we became the British Commonwealth Games, and finally we settled, I think it was 1978, on being called the Commonwealth Games. What it really shows is the development of the Commonwealth, and the development and growth and maturing of the Commonwealth from an imperial project to a Commonwealth project, which moved from a position of dominance by one group over another to a position of shared support, and I think that's really positive. So,
okay, so can you explain the significance of the Queen's Baton Relay?
Yeah, we've had the Queen's Baton Relay since 1954, and it was basically created, look, to be honest, just as a charming tradition that was created. It started off in 1954, and what it is a few months before the games, usually about 9 months, the Queen hosts an event at Buckingham Palace where she takes the message, the welcome message, which she's going to read out at the opening ceremony, and she takes that message and puts it in a baton, hands it to a runner, and that runner sets off, and through a relay of runners and modes of transport, the baton is transported right round the entire Commonwealth, all 72 nations and territories. Everyone gets a chance to see it, be sharing the excitement, get a bit of inspiration, maybe raise a few pounds or dollars for charity in the process, and so on. And then it returns to the games, just for the opening ceremony. It's great. The Queen's Baton Relay is a great unifying event for the entire Commonwealth.
So it says on your website that the Federation encourages and assists the education via sports development.
Yeah. How
important do you think this is to the future of the games?
We do, yeah. We do some projects which are around education and sports development, and just development, just using sport for development. The Commonwealth Games itself, we're not one of the largest sports organisations by any stretch in the world. There are much bigger sports organisations than ourselves. We tend to support quite small and distinct efforts. It's something that's quite core to our values, so I don't think it's ever something we'd want to stop doing. And it takes a variety of forms. At the moment, it's very on the ground stuff that we work with partners, and we're very proud to work with a really good series of local partners. It's not the kind of work we deliver directly ourselves, but we're quite happy to steer support and funding towards other people's activities. And it's simple things like we're supporting the training of swimming teachers in Bangladesh, where drowning is actually the leading cause of death for children under the age of 16, much higher than any other illness or disease. It's actually drowning. And so one of the things we are supporting there is the training of swimming teachers who go on to teach kids how to swim. We're supporting an initiative in southern Africa based around boosting the participation in women's netball, which is a really archetypal Commonwealth sport. Netball's not in the Olympic Games, it's only in the Commonwealth Games. So that's something we're really keen to support. We also support a variety of projects in other countries, which are basically just around using sports to either the development of sports themselves and coaching and administration of actual sports organisations. So we work very closely with Commonwealth Games Canada on a programme called Capacity Support, which basically involves supporting some of the smaller sports organisations in Commonwealth countries to just be better administration, better systems, better office systems, to manage their teams more effectively. And we also work with projects about tackling violence, out in the community. So, projects in some countries which, work with young people, young boys and girls who are perhaps in some perceived to be at some risk of drifting into, drifting out of school, for instance, and that again works really well. It's part of the strength of the Commonwealth that we do that kind of thing for each other.
Okay, what do you think the biggest challenge is throughout the years of the Games? What do you think the biggest? I meant change.
Yeah.
Say that again. What do you think the biggest change has been throughout the years of the Games?
I think for us, it's relevancy. If you go back to the early and middle years of the Commonwealth Games, the 1930s, 40s, 50s, even the 60s, what you would see is lots of world records set at the Commonwealth Games, extremely high profile. Now the Commonwealth Games is still a very high profile event. We are still the world's second largest multi-sports event after the Olympic Games, one of the very, very few global sports events of its kind. But it's a very different world today from the one that existed back 40, 50 years ago. Today, there are a lot of sports events in the calendar. It's a very, very crowded calendar. You turn on the television any time of the day or night, and there's something going on, some league, some tournament, some events going on somewhere in the world. And athletes today have got a lot of demands on their time. I mean, you just think about a British swimmer, for instance, an English swimmer such as Tom Daley. What's his priority going to be? Well, his priority is going to be, in order, an Olympic Games, his World Championships, FINA World Championships, European Championships, National Championships, and then probably after that, the Commonwealth Games. And it has to be that way because we're not a pathway event. If you think about it, all the other events can offer ranking points that will actually put Tom onto the world rankings, which ultimately will decide his qualifying for the Olympic Games. And yet the Commonwealth Games exists outside the ranking system because we can't award points to any athlete because in no region of the world, Commonwealth countries, the majority or even all of a region. And so we're a really major, really competitive sports event, but our biggest challenge is the fact that there are now today so many other sports events and so many other demands, both for the public's attention and for athletes' consideration. So, we work hard on maintaining our relevancy and staying popular.
So how do you see the Games developing in the future?
There are certain themes that I can see emerging. I think we will see a greater emphasis on sustainability as a sports event. And there already is quite a big emphasis on sustainability in terms of us hosting an event. And there has been since, I'd say probably Manchester 2002 was the first Games where you really noticed it. But I think even more so today, it's just got to be a no white elephant policy. There's no way a franchise owner like the Commonwealth Games or the Olympic Games, the IOC or ourselves, could ever sanction anything that involves littering a city with unused stadiums, as you did see actually in the past, up until quite recently. You look at Athens 2004, and Athens did not have a great experience with its venues, a lot of which are left being very underused. I think sustainability, I think building venues and maintaining an event which is really attractive and really good for a host city, and thankfully for the most part the Commonwealth Games does deliver that.
Do you think there's a difference with the original concept of the Games as they are today?
Yes, I do. I do think there's a difference. I think one of the things you notice about it in the early days is how white it was. And that's one of the really, really fascinating stories. And one of the fascinating things about the Commonwealth Games is watching that change over the course of a few decades. So when you look at the Commonwealth Games at the beginning, in the 1930s and 40s, it really was. It was basically a white male sport. I mean, even the women up until the 1940s and 50s really only started quite slowly to get a look in. And that continued for quite a while. And here's something that's quite surprising, which is in 1966, the Commonwealth Games was held in Kingston, Jamaica. And at the Kingston, Jamaica Commonwealth Games, Jamaica won no gold medals at all, not even in athletics, which is quite stunning when you think of what's Jamaica like today. I mean, Jamaica pretty much wins enough medals to equal some continents. That's the thing I find really, really inspiring, really interesting, is watching the Commonwealth Games become a mirror for changing societies. Something that really was kind of old, male and stale, and watching it transform into something that's become much more diverse, much more inclusive. So that's the great thing about the Commonwealth. It reflects those values, those Commonwealth values of friendship, equality, of family, and the way we're willing to extend that to other countries.
Excellent. Thank you so much.